Hello, everybody, and welcome to the FXB Center Work in Progress seminar. My name is Jacqueline Barber. I am the Director of Research at the FXB Center, and I'm delighted to be hosting this important discussion on climate change, structural racism, and organizing for change. I think it's fair to say that these three themes really incorporate some of the most fundamental goals and values of the FXB Center. We are very committed to thinking about the impact of structural racism across many domains of life. And we are, of course, also very concerned about climate change and very pleased to be contributing to a lively discussion about it in this week of all weeks, when the world's eyes are focused on what's happening in Glasgow at the Conference of the Parties. Many of us, I think maybe all of us at the FXB Center, think of ourselves as scholar activists. And so the idea of organizing for change is very much part of what informs our scholarship, it informs our work, it informs our lives. And so we really do have two excellent colleagues joining us to discuss these three important topics and their connections. And I'm delighted now to proceed to introduce them. We only have an hour, so I won't waste time and take time away from them and from the discussion we're going to have. So I'll introduce both of them, and then I'll hand it over to them to talk, and then we'll have time at the end for Q&A. So first of all, let me introduce Dr. Gaurav Basu, who is a doctor and also has an MPH degree. He is a founding co-director of the Center for Health Equity, Education and Advocacy, and is an instructor at Harvard Medical School in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine, and also a faculty affiliate of ours at the FXB Center. He has received numerous awards in medical education, including the Charles McCabe Faculty Prize in Excellence at Harvard Medical School and the Cambridge Health Alliance Academic Council Award. On a broader canvas, he's been recognized nationally for his work in climate change and health equity, bringing together these two huge topics. And indeed, he was named in 2021 as one of the 2021 GRIST leaders of climate change. And he's received many other accolades. So he's very well respected. Locally and nationally as well. And he does both organizing work and teaching work, but he's also a presence in the media. And many of us, I think, have heard his contributions on NPR or read his columns in the papers. So Dr. Basu, thank you very much for joining us, and a warm welcome to the FXB Center. Our second speaker today is Dr. Peder Stojcic. Dr. Stojcic is also an FXB faculty affiliate, and he's also an advocate and a scholar activist. He is the executive director of the People Power Health group, which is a group of community organizers and trainers who focus on social movements and community organizing skills to advance healthcare and to really impact the work of health professionals, caregivers, and healers. And he has worked with many different entities. He works in the hospital system, and he also now serves as on the advisory board of Leading Change Network, which is one of the largest global networks of social movement leaders. He, as I said, also has a medical background. He's originally from Serbia, and he got his medical training at the University of Belgrade. And he also has an MPH from the Chan School. So both our speakers are alums of our school, which is wonderful. So let me now invite you to make your comments, and then we'll look forward to the discussion, and a very warm welcome again.
Thank you so much, and really thrilled to be with you all today, and to be able to talk about this most consequential work. And just want to say a quick word to thank Dr. Baba, Dr. Bassett, Dr. Linios for really doing extraordinary leadership in the field of public health, of understanding that public health is in the work of structural change and social justice, and how we can more deeply engage with these most critical issues and rooted in issues of equity and justice is the leadership of this center, I think, is at the forefront of moving that forward. So Paige and I are thrilled to join this community and to speak to you today on the intersection of climate change and structural racism, and also explain how we believe community organizing is a critical piece of how we make progress into the future. So let me give you a little roadmap here. It probably goes without saying, but to try to take on these topics in a very brief amount of time, I bring a lot of humility in trying to speak to these. And of course, it'll be a very brief kind of framing of the issues. We should be talking about this hour upon hour, week after week, year after year. So I recognize that we'll just be touching the surface of these very large topics, but we'll do that framing today. And then we'd like to introduce a fellowship that the FXB Center is a partner in, the Climate Health Organizing Fellows. And then we'll turn it over to Peja to talk about some principles of organizing. Peja is a very well-respected community organizer, has worked for a long time with Marshall Gans, and I have learned a tremendous amount from him in how to use people power and the principles of organizing to make change. And of course, we'll save time for discussion. But what I'd like to start with is, and Paige, I might ask you to read the chat for me because I'm actually on full screen here, but
that's good.
When the word climate change comes to, when I present that word to you, I'd like you to name some emotions, a one-word emotion that comes to you immediately when you hear the word climate change. Paige, if you could read that to me.
People can feel free to put it in a chat.
Yeah.
Anxiety is the first one we got. Dangers, dread, scared, anger, fear. That's what we got so far.
Yeah. Well, keep them coming. But what I would say is that it feels important to me to put emotion at the beginning of this conversation. Because I think it is an emotional topic. I think it is a scary issue. And these things that people have listed out in the chat here are all emotions that I have felt myself as a physician committed to racial justice, as a parent of two very young children. I think we're going to cover a lot of ground today and have a discussion about it. But I actually think that these emotions that we feel, the dread, the worry, the concern, the paralysis that comes out of it is critical for us to engage with. And to recognize, to acknowledge, to cope with, and to understand what they mean to us. Because what the world needs now is clearly action, and these emotions are paralyzing. And there's good reason to feel those emotions, and I feel those emotions often. But I think in my work, in doing climate work, I have found a way to hold those emotions, to embrace the bigness of this work, and to feel how much we need to reimagine, both on the fronts of our relationship to our planet and how racial justice is at the foundation of how we can move forward into this world that we all deserve and all that our children and every person around the world deserves. And so I often think about climate change as really fundamentally about relationships. It's about our relationships to the earth, each other, and future generations. And I think climate change and racism are both real reckonings of how we have undervalued and not nourished these relationships, and how critical it is to get in right relation with these components so that we can make this world that we all deserve. Now, climate change. So a quick word on how 9 ways in which climate change and the burning of fossil fuels impacts health equity. So, and I'll just list them out. We won't go into great detail on each one of them, but this is the way I think about it. Natural disasters, extreme weather, food insecurity, water scarcity, infectious diseases, heat-related diseases, air pollution, mental health, and forced migration. And so when I speak to the medical students, when I speak to public health audiences, I always try to make the argument that no matter what you care about in health and in health equity, climate change is a threat to the thing that you care about. And you know, I make the argument that people who are passionate about the things that they are doing, you don't need to become a quote unquote climate person. In fact, all of us are climate people. All of the issues that we care about, whether it's about migration, whether it's about food security, whether it's about racial justice, whether it's about mental health, I believe that climate change is a fundamental driver of climate action is a fundamental driver of how we secure health into the future. And I also want to just make the broader point that you'll see me doing this today, and frankly, I should be doing a better job of it. But I use the word climate change, but really the conversation should extend to a broader principle of planetary health. And that means that we're not just talking about emissions, but really how we invest in the foundations of our ecological stability. So climate change is a heat trapping phenomenon from greenhouse gas emissions that causes our planet to dangerously warm. But we also need to be thinking about biodiversity, our ecological stability, about deforestation, air pollution, encroaching into habitats, misusing our land and water, and our relationship to agriculture and wildlife. And I'll just highlight, and without going into great detail, that of course COVID-19 really reinforces how critical it is, it being thought to be a zoonotic disease, that we right our relationship with nature and invest into our planet as a foundation of pandemic mitigation into the future. All right, so I'm going to start with a patient story. So I'm a primary care doctor. My patient has welcomed me speaking about him. I've written about him in the BMJ, but this is the hospital I work at. I'm a primary care doctor at a community health center. And this patient had not established care in the United States, but went to our emergency room. I had not met him yet. And he was a 30-year-old man with asthma who had moved to the United States a few years ago from Central America, a farmer back home and a parent of a young child, and had these upper respiratory symptoms for a few weeks. His family was kind of nagging him to go get it checked out. And especially after the symptoms increased to shortness of breath, or orthopnea, which means feeling particularly short of breath when you're lying down, and headache and fatigue. And tragically, the clinicians in the room will know that these labs came back to show that he was in a crisis and that his kidneys had failed, and that he was in fact in acute on chronic renal failure and needed to be hospitalized and dialyzed right away. It's a young man who had understood himself to be in very good health and had no concerns about any chronic medical issues. And so this was a devastating and completely unexpected diagnosis. And after a very long workup and a very detailed workup, it was found out that he had something we call CKDU, chronic kidney disease of unknown origin, they call it, or another frame that's being used recently is heat-triggered renal disease. And so what that means is that while a lot is not known about this phenomenon, I feel confident in telling you that I feel confident as his primary care doctor, that his exposure to extreme heat as a farmer in El Salvador, day in and day out for more than a decade, he was out picking crops for his community and making sure his community had food to nourish themselves. He was exposing himself to extreme heat, and unbeknownst to him, his kidneys were getting dehydrated. They were not getting enough blood perfusion, and slowly his kidneys were getting injured day in and day out, such that he ended up in the emergency room that day. And these are the medical issues that we need to be thinking about. This new era of climate medicine, as Dr. Sorensen, Garcia, Drebba-Nino state, is exactly the way we need to be thinking about the intersection of climate change and health equity. And I think a lot about farmers. I think about folks who are out there doing this hard labor and hard work, and the ways that they're exposing themselves because of the injustices of climate change. And I'll go through a few slides pretty quickly here, but as I was in my own reckoning and my own awakening about climate change at that time, and came to really be thinking about what this really meant, and I came to appreciate how much heat is a threat to everything I care about as a primary care doctor. And you can basically see it impacts every organ system here, but it increases heart attacks and strokes and poor obstetrical outcomes, mental health. And so heat can be often an invisible threat, but it's a threat that follows the fault lines of injustice and inequity throughout the United States and around the world. And then I continued to think. I practiced in Middlesex County in Somerville, Massachusetts, and came to learn that my community was warming at about 70% faster than the rest of the country. Without going into great detail, there's a ocean current that goes to the Atlantic Ocean. Is thought to be the slowing of that current, that jet stream might be contributing to the way in which we are warming at a faster rate than the rest of the country. So this was very much very real and very now, and it was a threat to my patients in a way that I don't think I was appreciating. My work with the city of Cambridge, where I live, and working in some task force has made me kind of appreciate how much heat has increased and the exposure to extreme heat has increased over time. Historically, there was about 10 days here, you'll see in orange, of days over 90 degrees of heat, maybe one day above 100 degrees. And again, going quickly through these calendars here, you can see how much it increases into about 2030, and then into the future about 2070. The other colors you'll see there with the yellow and the pinkish color are with worse climate scenarios. But regardless, you can see the ways in which exposure to severe heat is a current threat that is only increasing with time. And of course, this is an issue of health equity, as we've touched upon here, but I think it's important for people to understand this notion of heat islands. And so there's communities like Chelsea, which is a piece here in WBUR that was talking about the ways in which Chelsea, which is a community that is 80% people of color, 80% essential workers, the tree canopies that are present where I live in Cambridge, the green spaces, the parks, they're not present in Chelsea as much. And in fact, that community is more defined in physical space by concrete and asphalt and a lack of green space, a lack of tree canopies. There's a major study that showed tremendous tree canopy inequities throughout the United States, and the Northeast has the highest inequity in this front. And so a day that's 95 degrees in Cambridge, Massachusetts could be 110 and 115 degrees. So this shows again the ways that heat and climate change is a threat multiplier, it's an injustice multiplier all around us. And so this makes me step back a little bit for a moment and think about the extraordinary moment we're in. I think recently about how people generations from now will look back at 2020, 2021 and wonder what we were thinking, how we were grappling with these converging crises of our time and the extraordinary moment that we are living in. And so you'll see a picture here, a wildfire in California that's ravaging a senior center, and you'll see the COVID signs that are outside of that. And of course, we are painstakingly stumbling along in our work of reckoning with racial justice. And so there's moments, of course, all of us, I'm sure, and I can, of course, speak for myself, feel completely overwhelmed by these large structural forces at play and the ways they are overwhelmingly impacting health and equity and human rights and injustice. But I think what this moment, of course, and I think why the FXB exists, of course, right, is to speak to the bigness of these issues, to speak to the structural factors at play, to talk about the rights and the justice issues at play, and to embrace the bigness of this work, and to do the deeper work of understanding how they converge into more foundational work that we need to do to allow a world in which we are all able to thrive, regardless where we come from and who we are. And so there's this old adage that many of you have heard of that, I ask myself this question: how did we get here? And I think it's important to name the fact that every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. And of course, this wasn't an accident that we'd have the great racial inequities that we face today. Of course, it's not a mistake that communities of color are disproportionately exposed to air pollution and extreme heat, and globally, particularly to cyclones and to other to droughts and floods that are ravaging places like Bangladesh and sub-Saharan Africa. The systems that were put in place over generations were put in place because some people benefited and some people didn't. And so that's, of course, where I go to the extraordinary Dr. Camara Jones's work to name structural racism at the foundation of what has happened so far and the systems that have put in place so that we end up in this place. And I think that reckoning is critical so that we can diagnose this properly and understand how we forge forward. And so I'm sure many of you are familiar with Dr. Jones's definition of structural racism, but I'll describe it to everyone here. She describes racism as a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on the social interpretation of how one looks, such that it unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities, unfairly advantages other individuals and communities, and saps the strength of the whole of society through the waste of human resources. And so when I hear this definition of structural racism, I immediately think about climate change, because I think it was based on a foundation of systems that did exactly this. It unfairly advantaged some, unfairly advantages others, and sapped the strength of all of us. And so here's a study to make my point. So Jeremy Hoffman is a great scientist down in Virginia, and he looked at redline communities and non-redline communities. He took 108 of these communities. Redlining, of course, as many of you know, is a racist policy that was started in 1934 and existed for 34 years until the Fair Housing Act, and actively pulled resources away from communities of color with explicitly racist language over the span of decades. And so what he did was he looked at redline communities and saw that these communities were 2.66 degrees Celsius hotter than non-redline communities. And without going into great detail, that's a tremendous amount. The translational work of that is more heart attacks, more obstetrical outcomes, more strokes. That is dangerous for our health. And we got to connect the dots between those policies for 34 years, and the pulling away of resources based on racist principles, and the way that's playing out today. We've got to connect those dots. We got to think about those heat islands in Chelsea and understand that if those investments were placed, the tree canopies will be there, the parks and the vibrant public spaces would be there. Another way I think about structures and history is that we've got to acknowledge that transportation policy, I think actually Pete Buttigieg has done a good job of naming structural racism within transportation policy. These highways were placed purposefully in places in which communities of color would be disproportionately impacted. So not only did it transect vibrant public spaces and cut the community in half and transect some of these spaces, but it also exposed communities downstream from these overpasses to disproportionate air pollution and all the impacts and the health impacts thereof. So there's been a number of studies showing that the ways in which federal policy in the 1950s and the way the interstate highway structure was built disproportionately impacted communities of color. You can see how these would not be built in wealthy and white communities. This is a study that kind of keeps me up at night. When I read it, it jarred me. It still jarred me every time I speak to it. This was a JAMA systematic review that came out about a year ago that showed an association between air pollution and heat exposure with premature birth, low birth weight, stillbirth, and of course, when they did greater analysis, Black communities were more impacted by these obstetrical outcomes. This is a thing that the only words that I can even begin to say is it feels undignified, it is unacceptable, and that, you know, it shows again the intersections of intergenerational justice, of gender equity and racial justice all at the same time. This is air pollution as well. So globally, there was a major study that came out of Harvard earlier this year that showed in 2018, 8.7 million premature deaths could be attributed to air pollution. 1 out of 5 premature deaths were attributed to air pollution. And of course, other studies here showed that the inequities between air pollution is only increasing over time. So this is a study about particulate matter 2.5. And while air pollution in some ways has improved overall, the inequities of who is exposed to this air pollution has increased. I want to just say a word about the global impacts. And this is a talk in and of itself. This is a piece I wrote about a year ago. I've been working with an organization called the Child in Need Institute in West Bengal, which is where my family's from. I started working with them when I was a student. And the cyclone, so this cyclone came through West Bengal, impacting rural coastal communities and villages in the same week that the National Proceedings of Science showed that the frequency of Category 5 severe cyclones was increasing because of climate change. Again, really connecting the dots between international justice, racial justice, and climate change. I'm going to go very briefly about this. The short of it is that the IPCC report tells us that we need to get to net zero by 2030 and end all our emissions by 2050. We need to be ramping down our emissions aggressively year in and year out. Right now, without going into great detail in this complicated slide, we're headed towards about 2.7 degrees Celsius of warming, far greater than anything that could be considered a stable planet, stable climate. We need to hold in line the 1.5 degrees Celsius marker that the Paris Accord, that again will be discussed in Glasgow in just the next few days, I believe we have everything we need to make that progress, but we have made progress, but not nearly enough. And this is where we get to the point of imagination. I think, again, it can feel overwhelming to understand how far we have to go, how much suffering is baked into our past misdeeds. But it challenges us to do that foundational work of imagination and determination. And so when people ask me, are you pessimistic or optimistic? I don't think I feel either one of those. I just feel determined that we need to be a part of community that is finding courage and determination to do this work. I just also want to say a quick word that we often speak about how communities of color are disproportionately harmed by climate change. It's important to understand that the wisdom and the solutions that we need are also from those communities also. So I just want to highlight the fact that Indigenous communities make up about 24% of all land territories in the world. And those land territories make up 80% of the world's biodiversity. So you can see how disproportionately that planetary investment that these communities are doing is holding our biodiversity and ecological stability together. This is a book I like, Drawdown. If you believe we don't have the solutions we need, read this book. It's 100 solutions that will show you otherwise. So what I'll say more deeply, I didn't get to tell my story too much here because I wanted to jump in. But I believe that climate change is about our interconnectedness, our common humanity, and fundamentally about how we take care of each other better. And frankly, this was a lesson that I needed to learn through that 2018 IPCC report. I can still remember waking up one morning, looking at the New York Times, understanding the IPCC, that climate change was a much more grave crisis than I had appreciated. My history of working in human rights work and global health work, all the things I cared about. My wife was pregnant at that time, came downstairs and said, hey, can you read this with me? Came to really have a light bulb moment back in 2018, and now really believe that climate change is a foundational driver. It's a moral issue of how we make this world that is based on justice and equity, and that I believe is the fundamental driver of how we create health and health equity moving into the future. Paige and I are working with the Winslow Foundation to start up a fellowship that we're really excited about. And Paige is going to talk more about the principles of organizing, so I'll just touch upon it. But we're going to have a fellowship that starts in January. We've gotten a great amount of interest, actually. Applications have just come in. That's going to be monthly sessions on community organizing with some weekend immersions and personalized coaching. So what we ask people to do is to apply as groups of 3 to present a climate organizing project. These folks are already organized in their local communities doing climate and health equity work. We're going to come together as a community because we believe deeply in the value of community and work through community organizing principles and workshops and build these skills and apply them in real time to these community organizing campaigns. And why? It's because that climate change is a public health crisis, a health equity crisis, that health professionals are well positioned to be messengers and change makers, but that we're burnt out, that we see these big crises in a fragmented, chaotic, dysfunctional healthcare system. We want to speak to something bigger and deeper, that climate change can be daunting, but that when we come together with collective action, we can find our voice and we can find a way forward. And so I'm actually going to skip over this so we can hand it over to Paige, but we believe in people reconnecting with their values, finding their voice in the beliefs in who they are and what world they want, and being able to create a community organizing project that will allow us to do this work, the kind of deep work that we need to speak to these great issues. Paige, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, thanks, Garb. I'm always impressed when I hear you speak about this because of the passion that you have for this issue. And first of all, hi everyone. It's really great to be here, and thank you everybody on the FXB a team for creating this opportunity and this space for us to join. In many ways, I was talking to someone and they asked me about my experience. Short experience at FXB so far, and I said it feels like home for whatever reason, and I don't know why is that. And I believe it's actually because of the people who are gathered around here, that some of them I know and some of them I will get to know. So my name is Peja Stojčić, and I will briefly talk about, I know we want to leave some time for the conversation, but I think Garb and I were successful so far in putting all those issues at you that are creating a little bit of anxiety, like climate change, structural racism. I'm going to add to it by adding a question, how do we create structural change? Because that's usually the question that a lot of our colleagues get really, really anxious about, because it's one thing to recognize that change needs to happen at that level. The other thing is like, how do we even think about it? What are the things that we can do? And no matter how you ask that question of like, how do we create structural change? What is really interesting is that you will have to, at some point, and I hope people can see my slides here, at some point you will have to have some type of theory of change. You need to have a theory how the change will happen in the world. And this is where it gets interesting, because there are multiple advocacy theories that you can deploy. You can say like, oh, we're going to raise awareness, or we're going to, increase our presence in social media. Maybe we can even get to be a president of the United States on social media. I'm going to kind of like deploy a technical solution to a problem because there's a lack of technical solutions. Or we're going to have this, which is most common advocacy goal, is like we're going to have a top-down policy that will either at the national level, state level, local level, or organizational level create the change that we want. But there's an educational, like we're going to educate people. But one that we are interested about and that is organizing is this idea and the theory of change that unless we actually tap into the people power work, that it's really, really difficult to change some of those structural issues that we are talking about. And that it's a really simple kind of like line that you can make between all the structural issues and the question of power, who has it and for what reason, and how it was structured to replicate it or to build it over time, or to deprive certain people of power again over generations that are existing there. And power, when it's such a word that creates a lot of, again, anxiety, but in a way it's just a simple thing. It's the ability to achieve purpose. And think about it as a kind of like our ability as individuals, but also like our collective ability, which is really, really is what it's at stake and what is really, really threatened sometimes. And if you do think about that as an ability to achieve purpose, then it's the first thing that you will realize is that power is actually relational. And it's not about, having power because you have certain resources or whatnot. That can help. But there's always a relational component that allow every human being to actually be an actor and have agency in that space. Because like, if I have something that you need, basically I will have the power. If it's the opposite, but there's always two sides of that spectrum. So there's no power without a relationship with different groups, different people, different communities, different nations. So in that relationship lies the potential for that power to be shifted and changed in such a way that can actually create some of those structural changes. And, honestly, like I can speak a little bit about my personal story where I discovered that. I grew up in Serbia. Actually, I was born in Yugoslavia, if I'm specific about that. Changed 4 countries without moving, because some of those structures that existed out there were kind of like just dissipating in front of our eyes as we were growing up. And I was in the medical school, and I was in the operating theater with a professor who was basically one of the famous vascular surgeons. I wanted to become a surgeon. And he said, you're gonna be a great surgeon. You're skillful with your hands. You just need to stop wasting your time on that public health stuff that you're doing. And it was really interesting because the public health stuff was actually the work of building a movement of young people to address HIV/AIDS epidemic in the Eastern Europe that was kind of like really huge at that time. And government was not interested in that. We had a dictator, and the resources were scarce. Like there was none of them, literally. There was no budget for it. Yet there was a lot of resourcefulness coming from young people getting together, figuring out how to structure work together and how they can solve the problem that felt like a big unsolvable problem in front of them. And guess what? We were successful. We had like over 12 different spaces across the country, 5,000 volunteers, huge, zero budget. And at the same time, we were in the middle of the country that was in the civil war and that has a dictator. And guess what? 3 years later, when we built that relational power, we all joined the movement against the dictator. And that was another success of the people power movement where, after sanctions, international sanctions, and actually NATO military intervention, Milosevic was still in power in my country. And, it was the youth movement that got him out of there. And again, all of that shaped, I'm saying you all of that because I think it shaped my understanding as well of what it takes to make the structural change. And that whatever we do, it does require that type of people power that is really, really important in order to achieve the change. Which leads me to the last kind of like component and the most important component of community organizing, which is when you are doing community organizing and you're actually using the people power strategy to address the change, your first question is not what is the issue. Your first question is like, who are my people? And that is grounding us in the relational work immediately that Gaurav was talking about. And I think when it comes to climate change, that's the work that we need to do like on a scale, but we have to do it for any type of structural change. And that conversation has to be really clear, that is creating new relationships among the people who actually need to build power. We do have capacity as health professionals, I believe, to facilitate some of those conversations. And that is a beautiful thing about community organizing, because it does assume that as a community organizer, you're not taking the lead. You're actually trying to enable other people to step into the leadership position and build their power as a community, as a group, to achieve the structural change. So the first question is like, who are my people? The second is, what will it take for them to build power that is necessary to create change? And this is not like, I always talk about community organizing as a practice of enabling people to gain power, but it doesn't mean that that's always protesting or getting like, I think there's this illusion that we have to protest, and that's the only way to do community organizing. Yes, that's one way, that's one tactic actually. But unless it's grounded in a deep relational work that needs to happen, usually the tactics will work just for a short period of time. So to create change, we need power, we need the connections between people, relational power, that will allow them to then get the ideas and get the skills and abilities to create change for the work that they're doing. And this is I was lucky enough in my life to at some point be exposed to Professor Gantz at the Kennedy School, and my first interaction with him was online. We were doing some work in Serbia around corruption, and he was helping us structure some of the organizational work that we were doing there. And we spent 2 years working online. And then when I came here to Cambridge, he said, like, you're so tall, and I said, like, well, you're not. And it was really interesting, but it was this kind of like after 2 years of working online. But all of that to say is that Marshall would always say, I haven't invented the practice of community organizing. I spent some time codifying and thinking about how it can be taught, but this is a long tradition of people in different places and in different moments in time that were gathering together in collective and building collective capacity to create the changes and shape the world that they wanted at the time. And I think that's the work of our leadership moment, and especially as health professionals, is like to use those skills and those traditions to enable the communities to actually address some of the challenges that we're facing right now, including climate health crisis and climate justice crisis, and to that extent build planetary health. And that's what keeping me in the interest of this. And then also like really I'm interested in shaping that and enabling that for others. One important thing about the fellowship as well, it's so interesting. People sometimes get stuck into this conversation. Is this, if I'm working in an institution, is this for me? Like, do I have a place in this, or this is just for the community groups? We are not allowing for that dichotomy to be created explicitly, because we are saying like if it requires people power of different sort, you can do it within the institutions, and you can do it in partnership and in work with the communities. And it really depends in who are your people and who you can work with. So it is really a question, not like, oh, if I'm an institution, do I have a place in this? Is really a question, are you willing to build relational power in order to create structural changes in the institutions and in communities, and hopefully globally as well?